So I guess this will be my presentation. Just a heads up, I formatted this presentation as though I wasn't going to be giving a presentation, so it's a bit text heavy. I prefer to generally not give presentations that are text heavy, but nonetheless, this can still be used as a valuable resource outside of my own presentation. So I'm going to be talking about democracy in South Africa and the quality of it, the objectives. Identify how South Africa functions as a democracy and fosters democratic values, describe prominent ways in which contemporary South African governance has come up short in regard to being democratic, and then discuss implications of the current regime and what could be expected from it. So just to start out, I'm going to talk about how South Africa stands today. Presently, South Africa is a parliamentary republic. It features a three-tier system very similar to the US. It has an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, all of which are separate from one another. And then they're comprised of those organizations next to each one as listed. In the wake of apartheid, South African officials revamped the constitution. So with the end of apartheid, prominent figures of that new regime came together and rewrote the constitution, and then they decided what they would want for the future, eventually coming to the conclusion that they wanted to really institute institutions that are reminiscent of a very liberal democracy, which led to South Africa being viewed as a darling for liberals and social democrats worldwide on the onset of the new regime, just by what they wanted to achieve through their constitution. The ways that South Africa is democratic. They have frequent and free elections. The electoral system is described as being closed-list proportional representation with single-party electoral dominance. So frequent and free, public is able to vote. More so they vote for the parties instead of specific candidates, and then whichever parties win however much, they select members from their own party to fill those seats. Increased transparency and governmental accountability. In the new constitution, the South African government aimed to build trust between the public and the governmental entities. Just because during the apartheid era, there was a lot of discrepancies between what the government was doing and what the public wanted. And they really wanted to work against that past trend. And then there's also decreasing inequalities in society. So with the ruling party, the African National Congress, they are essentially the party that was meant to rework the aftermath and long-lasting effects coming from apartheid society and culture. And so a lot of what they were trying to do were trying to decrease these inequalities that were affecting a majority of South Africans, especially those predicated on racial and economic boundaries. Now, ways South Africa fails to be democratic. Lacks competition in general elections. The African National Congress has been the ruling party since 1994. That was when the new regime came on and the end of apartheid was. No other parties have really put too much of a fight up against the ANC. There has been, notably, declining support for the ANC since 2004, but nonetheless, the ANC has won each major general election by an enough margin. There's a problem with the separation of powers and checks on powers as it works with the party system in South Africa. The parliament is able to select key members for the executive, including the president. So it enables the majority party to essentially, if they win the legislative branch, they also win the executive branch, just by the way the executive branch is selected and the people that work in that regard. Another thing, stemming from the Constitution itself, is that the majority party can end up amending the Constitution whenever they are seeing a future in which they don't have as much power as they used to. So currently, because they're losing power or they're losing support, they're anticipating a time in which they don't have as much power as they've had in the past, and so they are changing certain things in the Constitution so that when they are removed from power, they will still have a tremendous amount of influence in the government. And then a major way in which South Africa fails to be democratic is the presence of state capture. So it's the classic political corruption type deal. In this case, state capture is powerful officials in key governmental positions abuse public resources for personal gain. This is usually done through undermining institutions that are meant to check and prevent corruption. So with that, it just goes further in creating that distrust between the public and governmental entities because the public, elects the party and or expects the party to select certain members that will do what the public wants, the whole reason why they voted. And then what ends up happening is that these people take advantage of the public and national goods and just for their own means, and then they also get away with it because there's a lack of enforcement of the rule of law equally across all people in South African society. So this state capture was a regular occurrence in the previous regime. That's under the Zuma presidency. He was the last president who just got removed back in 2019. So another thing that I just wanted to note was on a social level, there's a lack of effective changes in social inequalities, which stirs disliking within the public with the democratic regime. So interracial inequalities have been remedied slightly, but only slightly, a very marginal amount. However, intraracial inequalities, those that are like within non-white South African group altogether, they have increased dramatically. So the top one-fifth of non-white South Africans have had exceptional economic growth and like mobility for themselves, while the bottom two-fifths of that same demographic have been harmed dramatically. And then unemployment still affects non-white South Africans at higher rates than white South Africans, which is extremely like surprising and like a little bit concerning, just because generally speaking, when you do have great economic growth as South Africa has had, you expect unemployment rates to at the very least decrease a decent amount. But in South Africa, they have stayed the same, and they are exceptionally high for non-white South Africans. And then, furthermore, South Africans are gravitating towards authoritarian values over democratic values. This is resulting from the dissatisfaction with the current regime due to the presence of state capture and a lack of effectively decreasing the inequalities that I just mentioned. And then to a further extent, like South African government has also failed to consistently enforce that rule of law for all people, and so certain people get away with certain things, as seen with state capture. Public officials were manipulating and using their power for personal gain, and they were, acting in illegal manners, and yet they weren't tried as though at the same way that someone from the public would be tried for those same crimes. Outside of this, we have the contemporary regime and the implications from there. Ramaphosa is the new president, and he took over after Jacob Zuma was removed from office. His like mission is to set out and right the wrongs perpetrated by Jacob Zuma's regime, but also really get back to what the Constitution was initially for. So he started mentioning a new dawn, in which he's trying to root out all networks of state capture in the government and end them, prosecute them. He has also commissioned multiple independent investigations into major national companies, such as the one of the major electric companies in the state, in order to make sure that there's a minimization of the corruption present, and then to also catch officials that are slipping and allowing the harm to the state overall. So implications that can be drawn from this, I can realistically see an increase in trust between the government and the South African public, because Ramaphosa seems very certain that he will go about, at the very least, reducing political corruption, which means, at the very least, like the public will start seeing certain benefits coming from democratic institutions already implemented. I can also see a potential backdrift of the public's ideology. Furthermore, just shifting back to those democratic ideals away from the authoritarian ideals that they were slipping towards, due to the fact that they'll have probably more satisfaction from the government. And then, uh, because Ramaphosa was one of the first authors, or like one of the major officials involved in the Constitution process, like drafting the Constitution, um, I think it's realistic to see that there will be a stronger fulfillment of the Constitution as it was intended, rather than how the government really just wants it to be. So I believe that's it. It's just my citations. Yeah, and that's